portion of today's video is sponsored by LastPass. Be good, cat. Don't mess around with, yeah, just sit down there. It's good, cat. So recently I went on a little bit of a buying spree of a couple different weird looking cheap controllers I could find online, and today is honestly, I think, my favorite one that I ordered, just at least from looks alone, and that is this particularly thick looking Switch controller. Now, I say thick looking because honestly, from the photos I saw, I thought this was actually going to be a little bit bigger. I wasn't necessarily picturing a full-blown original Xbox controller where it's, huge and it's difficult to even reach the buttons, but I was thinking something a little larger than this, when in actuality, it's not too much bigger than a regular Switch Pro controller. The main body design is roughly the same size and layout. The real difference is when it comes to the overall grip design and shaping, where instead of being that kind of longer, thinner handle grip that we're used to on a lot of controllers, it's a much thicker, stubbier shape, which just gives it this appearance of being this, massive looking controller when it really is about regular size. I will say too that while I do think the kind of thick look of the controller is a little silly, especially in a Void, I really like how it looks otherwise. I think the color scheme here is really nice. I like this shade of blue and how it contrasts with the white. It's very much a kind of Wii style color pattern that I really like, especially how it has the blue on the stick bases with the gray tops. It's just, honestly, I think one of the better looking controllers I've seen for a low price point. There's a lot of cheap controllers out there where I don't really like the color choices, or they just go for the kind of plain black design and it's whatever. Aside from the grips on this being that kind of, different stubby design, it's a pretty nice looking controller, honestly. Obviously, there's a lot more to this controller than just the shaping, but this was definitely one of the reasons I wanted to check it out. As far as wireless controller options go, I don't think this is necessarily my favorite one I've seen out there, but it does have some merits worth talking about. So let's go over what it does well and things it doesn't do quite as well. Before moving on, I'd like to take a second to thank LastPass for sponsoring this portion of today's video. I used to have the worst time trying to keep track of all my usernames and passwords, and yes, I am ashamed to admit it, I definitely had some passwords I reused across multiple accounts, which is not a safe thing to do. With LastPass, that is not a problem anymore. It gives me an easy way to store and manage all my login information, so I don't have to remember and write down every single individual one, and most importantly, I don't have to deal with the pain of resetting a password every time I do forget. LastPass also autofills your credentials on mobile sites and apps on iOS and Android, so when you open up a page, it automatically fills in your username and password, making it super fast and easy. Topping all that off, LastPass allows you to store an unlimited number of passwords. It syncs all the information you need across multiple devices for free, and has a convenient way to let you share passwords with others whenever need be. Click the link down below to start using it today, and thanks again to LastPass for sponsoring this portion of today's video. Now let's get back to that controller. So first, let's just talk about this grip shaping again, because this is something that is definitely, I think, the most kind of standout part of this controller. A lot of other third-party Switch controllers you'll find out there, especially the cheaper ones online, tend to heavily emulate an Xbox controller or a PlayStation controller or even just the regular Switch Pro controller. This doesn't really look like any of those. I mean, the main body, sure, but as far as the grip shaping goes, this is a fairly unique choice out there, and it actually works a lot better than I would have expected. I think it's a little more dependent on hand size, but for me personally, this ended up being really comfortable over a long period of time. While I don't really have the usual kind of grip shape to rely on where I'm kind of gripping around the side of it, it just kind of sits the base of the controller in my palm and I wrap around, and it works really well that way, actually. The thing is, while I obviously don't have different sized hands to really try this, I really get the feeling that this is not necessarily going to be a strong one-size-fits-all approach. I think you either have just the right hand size for this to complement really well, or you're going to find it being either way too small of grip lengthwise for you to grab properly, or way too large if you have particularly small hands, and then it's just going to be really annoying as far as having to reach buttons or even just comfortably pressing things. Next, let's talk about buttons and sticks, because I have the sneaking suspicion that this is actually made by the same manufacturer as the other cheap wireless controller I took a look at. I mean, obviously the button layout is very similar, even though the grip design is very different, and even the designs on all of these buttons are the same. They could just be using some of the same individual parts, because while it does look very similar in some respects, it actually handles a lot differently as far as how the buttons and sticks feel. When I first got this in, opened it up, and just kind of tried some buttons out blindly before actually playing a game, a lot of the stuff here on the surface level is pretty good. There's a little bit of weakness here and there. The sticks, for instance, are a tad looser than I would prefer, but they don't really have a ton of friction on the outer ring, which is surprising for a cheaper controller. The front-facing buttons have a nice snappiness to them, although every now and then I feel just a little bit of stickiness. The Y button in particular just kind of seems like it hangs a little longer, which is a little dangerous for certain games depending on what you're playing. The shoulder buttons feel good, and I think the biggest thing, especially in comparison to that other cheap wireless controller I looked at recently, is the D-pad isn't bad. Definitely not my favorite. I've used a lot of better D-pads before, but this one at least has a fairly good feeling circular inputs. All the directionals feel fine. As far as just being like a cheaper controller goes, it's not a bad D-pad. Now, of course, like I said, this was just me kind of trying the controller out before diving into a game. Once I started playing stuff, I started to encounter a couple little issues. The front-facing buttons, and really just the buttons in general, are mostly fine. The biggest thing that ended up being an issue were these sticks. While they feel fine to use in terms of actual gameplay, the dead zones on these are very weird. And what I mean by that is that the amount of distance it takes in order for it to register an input is different for each direction. In particular, the right stick for me was having a lot of problems where if I tried moving the camera a little bit to the right in Zelda, just nudging it didn't register an input. Whereas if I was pushing in the left direction, it actually registered fairly quickly. There was still a little bit more dead zone than I would like, but it was a lot smaller than what the right side was having. You know, I thought maybe at first this was just a calibration issue. I went to the calibrator and messed with it. It seemed like it was reading okay, but even after doing all the adjustments and fixes, still getting that same dead zone. So it's really inconsistent in terms of how it reads each input. On the extremes, it's fine, but anytime you have to make any kind of more subtle movement, if you just want to tilt the stick a little bit for something in game, like you don't want to move as fast, or you're trying to adjust your aim, especially for a right stick, it's just has not been the best experience. The rest of the buttons and everything, including the D-pad, were all mostly fine. Again, I think there are definitely better controllers out there that you're spending more money on. For a cheaper controller, the rest of this actually worked out pretty well. It's just the dead zones on the stick were definitely a problem. And there's a couple other issues that start coming up when it comes to some of the secondary functions of the controller. For instance, I really am not a fan of how the rumble in this controller feels. Rumble's one of those features that is very easily hit and miss with a lot of cheaper controller designs, and this is one of the ones where it's definitely a miss. The biggest problem it has, I think, has to do with actually the design of the grip itself, where because there's so much kind of extra empty space inside this controller, the rumble just feels exceedingly hollow. It has a decent amount of intensity to it, but you very easily notice the rumble is kind of centralized in the middle of the controller, and you just kind of feel how empty the rest of the controller is as it does it. It's just not a very satisfying feeling, especially if you have used any of the nicer controllers out there, like the Switch Pro controller or an SN30 Pro. As far as other secondary features go, the motion controls on this actually were pretty good, about the same as the last wireless controller I checked out, which is very close to the Switch Pro controller. Again, when I was doing really in-depth back and forth between the two, I was noticing just the smallest bit of drag on this compared to a Switch Pro controller, but very, very minor. And like most other cheaper controllers out there, this does not have an NFC reader, so you can't use Amiibo with it or anything like that. You'll still have to rely on using a regular Joy-Con in your Switch, which is normally not that big of an issue. You should have one of those around if you need that function. One other problem I did have with this controller are syncing issues. Now, it wasn't the kind of thing where after I connected to my Switch, it was disconnecting or dropping connection. Nothing like that was happening, but just getting it to connect in the first place was sometimes a little more annoying than I felt it needed to be. Even when I had previously synced it to the Switch, it wasn't auto reconnecting, especially if I was already in a game. If I was on the Switch home screen, it was fine, but there were a lot of times where if I was playing one game and I wanted to switch which controller I was using, turning this one on did nothing. It just kind of kept going on the syncing light, nothing would happen, and I would end up having to go back to find controllers to set it up, which at the end of the day isn't the biggest problem in the world, but it is kind of annoying. Also, just like with that other Amazon wireless controller I did recently, this does not wake up your Switch, which I know is a big deal breaker for a lot of people out there because they like the option just sit down, pick up a controller and start playing right away, and this isn't going to let you do that. Overall, this controller came with both good and bad surprises. I really thought this was going to be a very uncomfortable controller to use, but once I spent some time with it, I really didn't have that many problems with discomfort. It was a pretty comfortable controller. It just had problems with lots of little things everywhere else. The syncing issues, the dead zones on the sticks, the rumble, which is just not the best feeling rumble out there. I think if you're looking for a cheap wireless controller, there are definitely better options out there. The one I talked about a couple of weeks ago, aside from the D-pad, which this does have an improvement over, I think was stronger in a lot of other areas as well. I think the biggest kind of sales pitch for this is if you want just kind of a decent, basic, cheap wireless controller that also honestly just looks good. I know it's kind of a vain reason, but I really like the aesthetic of this controller compared to a lot of other cheap ones out there, and I think that's the biggest sales point it has going for it. Again, not functionally the best one out there. I think there are better buys for the same price, and definitely better buys if you're willing to spend more, but yeah, it's okay.